Assalamoalaikum, greetings of peace. I'm Farina Siddiqui with your voice. It's not with me, it's about you, it's with you to think about and to talk about, spread more. We have a very special guest in our studio today to talk about something very important that affects you and I. We have Shaikh Mustafa Khattab. Dr. Mustafa Khattab has presented something really beautiful to the community, the clear Quran. Let's hear from Dr. Khattab what clear Quran is. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jazakallah.
Assalamoalaikum.
Walaikum salam.
And it's a pleasure to have you here, mashallah, with our shaykh of your caliber. And mashallah, your qualification is always a pleasure to have you, alhamdulillah. So for our viewers, Dr. Khattab, please tell us more about your background, your qualification, and your,
Well, it's a very long story, but I'll give you the short version of it. I was born in Egypt, 1977, and with no potential whatsoever of going to school, but just like the rest of my family and most people in the village. But my mother put up a very big fight for me to go to school, so I became the first educated person in the history of my family.
Amazing.
So I joined AlAzhar at the age of 7, and I studied there for over 30 years. I got my bachelor's, my master's, my PhD in Islamic studies in English from there. And I memorized the Quran at a young age, the age of 12, and I got ijazah. So this is like my field, Islamic studies in English, translation, and Dawah.
MashaAllah, amazing, great. So what brings you to Canada and when?
Well, because I studied Islam in English, I'm able to preach the message of Islam in English. And I left Egypt in 2007. So I spent the last 12 years in the US and Canada in the capacity of an Imam and a translator and Da'i.
So mashallah, you have this international experience in spreading the message of truth, which is amazing, which is an asset to North American society. So tell me more about the clear Quran.
Well, the clear Quran, my first translation was done in 2002 and 2005, and that was basically, I was part of the team that translated the Quran live from Mecca and Medina. And you still see the translation in Ramadan, the 2-3 lines, the subtitles from Masjid Haram in Mecca and the Prophet's Masjid in Medina. So we did that. I was a member of the team that did this first translation live from Mecca and Medina. Back in 2013, I had an incident, and I told the story many times, but I'll give you the short version of it. I was in a cab with a cab driver in Toronto, non-Muslim, a Caucasian, and he said, he doesn't like Islam because he is called an animal in the Quran. And I said, well, it doesn't say that anywhere in the Quran. And he says 855. And I told him, no, it talks about the people of Mecca who violated the peace treaties at the time. And when they are called Sharrat Dawabi, it means the worst of all beings, not only it doesn't mean an animal here. And Allah explains it in the Quran in chapter Surah Nur 24, ayah 45. Allah created every dabba from water. Some of them slither on their bellies, some walk on 2 feet, and some walk on 4. So it's a very general term, and he says this is what his translation says. So I said, you know what, I have to do a translation, a new translation of the Quran. And all translations like Yusuf Ali and Pickthall and many other translations, they use either animal or beast for this word. So I decided to do a new translation of the Quran. So it took me, I've been working on this translation for the last 5 years. And alhamdulillah, I did the translation, then I had a team of more than 75 imams and scholars and editors to help me with the editing and tweaking the translation.
So based on your conversation with that cab driver, it was kind of your motivating factor. But you knew that there are so many translations available in the community, and North American Muslims and even non-Muslims refer to them. So why did you think you needed to redo it, and how this translation is different than others?
Okay, so basically the question is always, why does the world need a new translation of the Quran? So I have to give them a little bit of background. The Prophet ﷺ passed away in the year 632, Gregorian. And basically the first translation of the Quran in English by a Muslim was done in the 1920s. right? So this is like 70, 80 years ago. So for 1,300 years, the Quran was never translated by a Muslim. Most translations came from missionaries and Orientalists and stuff.
Okay.
And this is why you see words like infidel and holy war and stuff. These are not Islamic words. They are not Quranic words. But they were used in translations by non-Muslims, and some of them are still in circulation. From the 1920s till now, a total of about 115 or 20 translations have been produced. Some are by non-Muslims or by Muslims, and many of them don't actually have the qualifications to translate the Quran. And this is something amazing about Quranic translations. Some of them, they don't have any formal or academic training in translation, Arabic or English, Islamic studies, Arabic studies, ulum al-Quran, and so on and so forth. So some of them, like, I've seen a translation by a technician, a translation by someone who calls himself a scientist. They have nothing to do with Islamic or Arabic or Quranic translations, and they translate for pride or whatever reason. And this is why they keep recycling some of the old mistakes in translation. So they basically are not qualified. And I always tell people, you have to look for qualified translators of the Quran, and you don't just, read any translation, because every single one who translated the Quran, they say, I have produced the finest translation ever, even if they are the least qualified, right? And I tell people, if there is a translation of the Bible that was done by an electronics engineer or anyone, and they have no training in the Bible or in Latin or Greek or in Hebrew, and no training in translation, no one will trust this translation. The only time this is a translation like this is trusted is in Islam, right? So there are so many translations that have been done by people who are not qualified at all to translate the Quran. And on top of that, they claim they have produced the finest translation ever. Linguistic mistakes, mistakes in understanding the text or translating into English, and the concept and aqidah issues and so on and so forth. There are so many terrible things, and some of those mistakes are used sometimes by missionaries to prove that the Quran has mistakes and has contradictions.
Right. So we'll be right back talking about the North American context after a short break. We're talking to Dr. Khattab. Welcome back. We're talking to Dr. Mustafa Khattab about the Clear Quran. What Clear Quran offers to the community is incredible, and let's hear it from Dr. Khattab about the impact of Clear Quran on North American society and most importantly Canadian society. So Shaykh, you provided us with the background of why it was needed. So how do you see Clear Quran supporting Muslim Canadians or the Muslim Canadian context, or combating Islamophobia? Would you like to describe a bit of that?
Well, what we need at this point is a tool, a good translation that is a good tool for Dawah and for teaching our kids about Islam. But if we look at some of the old translations, they use Old English like thou and thine and all that stuff, and it doesn't make sense for a lot of kids, especially when they memorize the Quran, they do hifz, and they don't understand what they are memorizing. It makes it very difficult for them. For a non-Muslim who is looking into Islam to see this final message, final revelation, and in translation, the message doesn't come across as easy and clear, and it provides a lot of ammunition for Islamophobes to take things out of context and use it against the religion. So we have to provide like a background of the verse, why it was revealed, and how we can relate this to our time, and so on and so forth.
So it's basically translation and the proper context, which is called tafsir?
Yes.
Okay. So if I can quickly ask you for an example, like there are so many things that we get under the heat, and we want to defend Quran, or Quran doesn't say. No, we don't want to shy away from what Quran says, but we want to be able to describe it properly. Like for instance, you spoke about infidels.
Yes.
So how is it different now in the proper context and language today? So how did you describe it?
So basically, the Quran is a scripture, just like the Bible and any other scripture. And if for you to understand it properly, you have to understand the time when this book was revealed, and the historical background, and so on and so forth. So, for example, if there is a passage in the Quran that talks about like fighting non-Muslims, you have to understand what kind of non-Muslims it is talking about.
Right.
Because, for example, if it talks about fighting the pagans, and so on and so forth, or the disbelievers in general, we have to understand that this verse is talking particularly about the people of Mecca or Arabia at the time of the Prophet. So it is not open-ended. So these are the people who were making peace treaties with the Prophet, and they were violating them, and they were conspiring with others, and they attack Islam with the intention of killing Muslims and the Prophet ﷺ himself. So when it talks about these people in the Quran, it talks about a specific group of people. So it is not general. And the proof of this is, if you go, for example, to Surah 60, verse number 8 and 9 and 10, it talks about compassion to non-Muslims and treating them with mercy and respect, because they are not fighting and attacking you and persecuting you, right? So if you read the Quran, you will come out with this message. If you read things in context. Respect and be compassionate and merciful to those who are good to you, regardless of their faith. And if someone attacks you, you have to defend yourself regardless of their faith. And I always give the example, if you wake up in the middle of the night and there's a burglar in the house, you don't usually ask for their photo ID before you fight them, right? It doesn't matter if the person is Muslim or a non-Muslim, right? You have the right to defend yourself. But if someone is good to you, you have to be good to them, regardless of their faith. Faith has nothing to do with it if you read the Quran. Because it also talks about fighting Muslims in Surah Hujurat 49. If they attack you or they are unjust, you have to stand up for justice, right? So it has nothing to do with religion.
So another very common misconception or fear, actually, I have a lot of, and we all do have a lot of friends who are from Christian community or Jewish community, and they talk about Yahud and Nasara and how they are presented in Quran. And there is a misconception that is being spread by Islamophobes, who have the intention of divide and rule kind of to the community. So how do you address that, or how does the clear Quran address that?
Well, the Quran is very fair and very just. So as I mentioned, it says that, again, if someone is good to you, show compassion to them and be good to them. And if someone attacks you, you have the right to defend yourself. And one of the most amazing examples in the Quran, if you read in the clear Quran in chapter 4, a passage with the title of Justice to a Jew. So basically, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, here in the clear Quran, chapter 4, from verse 105 to 112. So basically, a Jew in Medina at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he was accused of theft. So a Muslim, a hypocrite, stole a shield from another Muslim, and he gave it to the Jew as a trust. So people found the shield with the Jew. So he was accused of theft, and the family and friends of the Muslim who stole it came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, "You're not going to rule in favor of a Jew against a Muslim?" And this passage, it's about a page in the Quran in chapter 4 that says, no, the Jew is innocent and the Muslim is the thief, right? So the Prophet ﷺ stood up for the right of a Jew in the Quran. And the pagan who was in charge of the Kaaba kept the keys. It's also in the same surah, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُكُمْ أَن تُؤَدُّوا الْأَمَانَاتِ إِلَى أَهْلِهَا. So a Muslim took the keys of the Kaaba by force from this pagan, Uthman ibn Talha. And the ayah was revealed, Allah is commanding you to give the trusts back to their rightful owners. And the Prophet ﷺ took the keys from a Muslim and he gave them back to the pagan. And he said, this is for you and your family.
So that's justice, social justice in
Yeah,
Islam.
the guy is not Muslim. And this, the descendants of this man, his family, they still have the keys till this day.
Oh, subhanallah.
Yeah. So Islam stands for justice regardless for who. And if someone is committing abuse or injustice, Islam will stand against this person even if he or she is a Muslim.
Amazing, amazing. And you brought us these 2 copies of Clear Quran, Sheikh, and you were talking about the importance of this copy you have.
Yes.
What's the significance of this copy?
This particular one, I used it for the oath for my Canadian citizenship. So this is my personal copy right there.
Okay, that's amazing.
And this is the American edition, and this one is the Canadian edition. And we already printed 5,000 of these We are ready, inshallah, to send them to each to a single library in Canada. So 5,000 libraries, public libraries in general. So one important thing about the Quran, the clear Quran, before we move on. So at the beginning of every chapter, I gave a very short introduction, like a few lines, 5, 6, 7 of them, to just highlight the main theme and the connection between this chapter, the one before and the one after. And I give like the historical background. And I give footnotes to explain the controversial issues. And I explain different things in the historical background as well. And I put titles to every passage. I group the ayat based on their theme. I put the title, making it now difficult for people to take things out of context. If you want to understand the passage, you have to read the title and the historical background, right? And I gave an introduction at the beginning on the most commonly common questions about Islam, about jihad, about hijab, and the treatment of non-Muslims, and so on and so forth. And I put a thematic index at the end to list all the topics of the Quran in a thematic way. So I believe this is the first thematic translation of the Quran.
Amazing. So you did an amazing job presenting this as a sadaqah jariyah to the community, mashallah.
Yes.
What's the response of the community? Are you happy with the response that you were expecting, or is it different, better, worse?
Well, alhamdulillah, I've seen a lot of support from the community. And also in the US, there are some, our publisher there is very active, and every year they give out like 500,000 copies for Dawah and for prisons and schools and so on and so forth. And alhamdulillah, our publisher here in Canada is also trying to fulfill the need. And those who actually read the translation, they see the value of this work. But those who didn't see it and they're not familiar with the work, and I'm on Facebook and I see people posting ayat from different translations, Old English, difficult, hard to understand, and I don't feel happy about it, because now we are taking the Quran translation to a new height, and you want to go back to the translations that were made in the 1920s and 30s. Just a few months ago, a brother, he's a publisher from Southeast Asia, he came and he showed me a translation of the Quran that he's working on, and with illustrations and colors and different things. And he's using Yusuf Ali translation from 1934. And I told him, you lost your mind. Even college graduates cannot understand the translation, right? And you're producing this for little kids, grade 1 and grade 2. Do you know what firmament means? He didn't know the word. And I said, it means sky or heaven. No one is using the word, and so on and so forth. There are so many different things, but I don't want to dwell on this. We have to move on and present the message of Islam in a good way.
Jazakallah khair for being on the show and describing it so beautifully, mashallah. May Allah bless you for doing this. Time is never enough when we're talking with a sheikh like you. But before we finish the show, do you have any message that you would like to give out to our viewers?
Yes, my message is very simple, because the Quran is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and what we have here in English is not the Quran. This is the tafsir of the Quran in English, right? So basically, this is a human effort to explain the divine in a language that people can understand. 85% of Muslims, they are not Arab, they don't speak Arabic. So we have to provide the translation of the Quran in a way they can relate to, in a way they can understand. And even kids should be able to understand the Quran before they memorize it. A couple of things to look at before you choose the translation of the Quran. There are so many out there. Number one, you have to see if the translator is qualified to translate in the first place or not. If he or she is not qualified, don't pick the translation, because this is an amana. And number two, to rank the translations of the Quran, we have to look at four things to see if the translation is good or bad. Number one, the accuracy of the translation, which means that the translator was able to understand the Arabic. And number two, clarity. So accuracy and clarity. Clarity is their way of translating the Arabic into English. Is it accessible or not? And number three, the eloquence. Were they able to reflect the beauty and the power of the Quran? And number four is the flow of the translation. Is it flowy? Is it good? Is it something that the youth can read and understand or not? So please keep this in mind when you pick a translation of the Quran. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair. May Allah reward you for your time and this effort, and I hope it benefits more people in the community.
Jazakallah.
So this was Dr. Khattab explaining why the clear Quran fights the misconceptions, Islamophobia, and relieves a lot of problems in our community when it comes to translation of Quran. And as Dr. Khattab said, it's very important for us to understand Quran ourselves in more clarity and help spread it. So mention this to all your networks, mention this to all your friends and family, and help them get at least one copy of Clear Quran. And the link will be on our website. The link will be at the bottom of our screen. And we will be able to access Clear Quran from Dr. Khattab. And if you would like to buy a Clear Quran from us, we will be able to provide that. Email us mcmninfo@gmail.com. I'm your host, Voice with Farina Siddiqui. Assalamualaikum.